And I'm going to make an introduction. And the introduction is, we have Ryan Rastok with us. I think probably quite a few here are acquainted with him. He's the owner and main man for the Lawrence Arborists. Been doing this for quite a few years. I think he'll let you know about his history, but anyway, this is about, should say, a new tree, and then how to plant it properly. So I'm going to turn this over to him.
Thank you, Larry. How's everybody doing today? After a riveting business meeting, are you excited to talk about tree selection? I know how those go. I'm on a few boards myself. So thank you, Larry. Ryan Rastok, Lawrence Arborists. Some background about me. I'm a board certified master arborist. That just means I'm a total tree nerd and spend way too much time, my personal time and professional time, doing this stuff. Tree risk assessment qualified. I'm actually through graduate school of Forest Entomologist. So a lot of my other passions outside of climbing trees, pruning trees, and trees in general are insects that cause devastation in trees. Namely emerald ash borer. I'm probably one of the regional experts on that particular insect. And so, so that's us. And in regard to our business, we do a whole lot of stuff. We do a lot of consulting, so helping people formulate different aspects. I do a little bit of expert witness work, and I'll probably be doing some more of that in the future in the process of getting my registered consulting arborist credential with the American Society of Consulting Arborists. So that should be coming up pretty soon. So that's pretty exciting. Some new challenges there. And we, of course, also Lawrence Arborists, we're all tree climbers, and we prune trees, remove trees, and just try to have as much fun as possible in the trees. And so we also do a live presentation series. How many people here have been to the Tree Talks presentation series that we do? Yeah, pretty fun, right? Yeah, so it's a mixture of chaos, interest, and just passion there for people with trees. So check it out the next time. We should have one the day after Arbor Day. If we get our permits, it'll be a community climb, and we'll be doing the Tree Talks topic on tree climbing specifically, as long as we get our permits through. We also have our own little podcast here, the Arb League. Has anybody checked that out? It's a little different, but it's great. Actually, our next episode coming out will be with Jennifer Smith. If any of you are familiar with her, she's a dear friend and colleague of mine, and was actually my instructor coming through the Master Gardener program back in like 2008 or 9. So I was hoping to get it out before this so y'all could listen to her talk about trees, because the topic is actually pertinent as well. The title of that episode is Planting Trees for a Shared Space and Community. So stay tuned for that. We'll get links for something that's pretty fun. But now kind of moving on to the topic of today, I have to tell you, these are the hardest recommendations for me to give, because I just know too much about trees, right? And so my entire career being a forest entomologist and also an arborist, very few people are calling me to say, hey, come check out this amazing tree. It's so great. Usually almost always I'm getting called to a place because there's a problem, right? The tree is dying. It has girdling roots. It's declining. It has disease. The fruits are too messy. The foliage. So I can list just about anything anybody's ever told me that they dislike about trees. And honestly, most of those things wouldn't bother me at all. But it does pose some challenges. So always in the back of my mind, as I'm giving recommendations, I'm also thinking about how mad they're going to be at me in the future when the fruits are obnoxious or whatever that is. And so, so this presentation, I'm not going to go through specific recommendations of exact species to plant, but more of a thought process to go through to help you kind of decide when you're working with your clients or master gardeners or yourself of kind of how to think through selecting the right tree. And this isn't just the right species. This is also getting the specific individual tree from the nursery. We're going to talk about how to select that, because often some of these insidious issues that we deal with tree mortality are entirely preventable, starting from planting, tree selection to planting. I think we're dead here. Yep. Oh. And so yeah, we're going to walk through that process and kind of how I'll walk our clients through and how I think about it in my mind, right? And so it's gonna be a little bit of text here, so I apologize, but this is kind of the whole my brain, like if you were to do tree selection, this is like what's going on mostly in the order in which I think about it for trees, right? And down here, attributes that could also be put as aesthetics. I put that very extremely, those subjective qualities down here, I put way down at the bottom with tree selection. And the reason I say this and bring this up is because most people flip this whole thing upside down and they pick the tree first. They say, oh, I want this whatever, this beautiful tulip poplar to grow in this space or whatever, they don't have the space requirements, maybe maybe it's not adapted to that climate or the soils and so on and so forth. So I tend to do the exact opposite of what most people do, and that leads to better success in my experience. So why we say don't go after the species first, do all of these things first, and then that'll give you a population of trees that you can then have better success with planting. So you guys ready to go on this ride? So hardiness zone, we're master gardeners. We're all familiar with this hardiness zone, right? And so basically this talks about the hardiness zone, but we can also incorporate rainfall and snowfall, sunlight, lighting, prevailing winds, and so on and so forth. So these are the climatic conditions that certain trees need to have for it to be optimized. And so some of y'all are familiar with this. I just screenshot this morning, so I don't know why it says 2015. But this was screenshot from the Arbor Day website. It'll be on the next deal. But basically what it is the tree's ability to survive low temperatures. This is one of the things, like, we should be considering species that fit within this cold hardiness zone here first. Like, that's the population of trees to choose from. And that's not just the species specifically, because you could have a species that has a native range that goes all the way down here into zone 9, but it was also here. If you get those genetics, you call it a provenance. So everybody's familiar with that terminology. So same species, just different geographic origins. And so the genetics may or may not be adapted to our climate zone, while the species will be. So where you're sourcing that planting material, if its genetics are from here, they're shipping it all the way to here, you might actually have some issue with that tree. So it can be pretty complicated. Incompatibility with the hardiness zone can lead to increased stress levels in the trees, right? So I have a great conversation, or I have a great presentation about tree stress, abiotic environmental stress. It's basically called what like basically flushes trees down the toilet. Most of it is environmental stress. And so if you're planting a tree outside of its optimum range, that's just a chronic level of stress that tree is experiencing that then can lead to a cascade of other issues in regard to insects, disease, so on and so forth. And so that chronic stress, you plant that tree's already not going to be in a good way starting out. And then that can increase its susceptibility to pests and pathogens and things of that nature. And we also consider this idea of the compatibility to the site. So we have these concepts that I talk about: native, non-native, as distinctive from invasive. There might be times when we will recommend a non-native species, as long as we know that doesn't have a propensity to become invasive. But I want to touch on provenance here again. So we're talking about a native species, say like hackberry or something, just throwing that out there. We could have the genetics or the provenance native to our region here, but if we were getting it from Georgia, we might have some issues. If those genetics of that exact same species are not from this hardiness zone, you can have some issues there. So a lot of people kind of overlook that and get some issues there. I won't get into or expound upon my philosophy on native and invasive species, but just knowing that that's there. Any questions? So I looked this up this morning, just to show you. You go to this Arbor Day website, y'all are probably familiar with this. So I think I got the zip, this is my zip code, 66044. I think it's 046 here, but I doubt that it's that different than here in my house. So it'll just spit out what that hardiness zone is. And there's all different types of publications you can consult to see what species are compatible with that hardiness zone. And so that's just one part of the puzzle. These are older maps from 2020. So you also want to make sure that your trees are adapted to things like your average annual temperatures, right? Your total precipitation that you have, and or the frequency of those things. So huge oscillations in temperatures, can cause big issues with trees that are long perennial, long-lived organisms. So being aware of these as well. So not just like the hardiness zone. I know a lot of this is review, but a lot of this just gets skipped over. People are like, I want that beautiful flowering tree, put it in the ground, and then they don't consider any of this stuff and they languish or become really resource intensive with a lot of money, spraying, fertilizing, whatever that is. So also considering these things here. So you're basically what I'm telling you now is basically you're figuring out that big population of trees that then you should be selecting from, right? Based on these things, it's kind of reviewed here. And so there is a publication. Has anybody consulted this? You can just, I know this is kind of a mess of a link, but I can send it out or whatever. So this, my colleague, Kim Baumberger, she's recently retired from Kansas Forest Service. She compiled this document. And so basically takes all those things I was just talking about more or less, and then puts it in by region. She has this specifically kind of to our region here. So it's a great place to start. And if we have time, we might be able to pull that up and you can like throw out a species and we can see what she says about it. But this is a great document to look up regionally as a starting point for that. So if you're looking for specific species, I'm probably not gonna give any because I don't know the specifics of each planting location you're dealing with.
Where did you?
It's like the Kansas Forest Service website here. It's really long link that I'm sure we can write down very quickly. But no, I can send it out or whatever. Good. It's a great publication. So, recent update. So you can see it's even like fine scale. So like not just it's like also her experiences and her colleagues' experiences specifically to like Northeast Kansas. So that can help you there. Then the soil, I'll tell you what, when I went to college and I had to take a class on soils, I about fell asleep in every lecture that was ever in existence. And I now regret that. You know, I've been doing this for about 20 years. And I find this to be the most fascinating part about many of the trees that I deal with today. Because it's so important. We get so hyper fixated on the above ground portions of those trees because that's what we see. But really the magic is happening here, and the magic is happening here as well in regards to selecting your trees, right? The soils are incredibly important. The root systems, arguably, while all points of those trees, the roots, the trunk, the twigs, the branches, all of those are all equally important. But if you had to place a higher value on one of those organs, it would be the roots. The root systems are incredibly important, often neglected. And so with this, we're trying to select our tree. These are some of the soil requirements that we'll be looking to. The physical volume of soil, right? The structure of that soil, we'll go over some of these graphs and things like that you've seen before. The chemistry, pretty important. Porosity, if we have huge issues with that in urban areas. Then the root zone requirements for the species, right? So we have all of these like physical limitations, and then we have the species that also needs certain things for its root system to thrive. So pH, everybody's kind of familiar with this. I just love this little diagram from a little line all the way over to these, examples here. And so can anybody think of a tree, like if you've worked with trees or fielded these questions, what's like a really common tree here that we're dealing with pH issues? Shoot it out, we'll throw it out there. Which oaks? Pin oaks, what's going on with those? Close, why? Often a pH issue. That can cause a nutrient deficiency of iron, micronutrient essential for building chlorophyll. And so you get those elevated pHs, 7.5 or above. And then what it does is it kind of more or less makes that in an inaccessible form for that tree. So the iron could be present and abundant in the soil, but if the pH isn't up, then that species might languish, right? And so we need, before plugging that tree into the ground, we need to know something about the pH of the thing. So that's why we're seeing that, at least with that species. It's usually pH and or compaction and root damage can contribute to that as well. And so the pH is incredibly important because if you just did a nutrient assessment of this, it could say, oh, there's a sufficient amount of iron in that soil. It shouldn't be an issue, but it's the pH really that's contributed to that. So getting the soils tests, I encourage everybody to get the soils tests as well. It's important. And so everybody familiar with this? Yeah, this is the thing I fell asleep. But yeah, this is your soil texture triangle. And so down here, basically you have your sand down here at the corner, 100% sand, your clays, and then your silts, and then various combinations of what we call a loam when there's combinations of those things. So certain trees have certain optimum requirements of what that soil texture should be, right? And that in urban landscapes often gets homogenized and compacted and damaged through construction activities. And so what you could have, say, you could have a pH of 7 in the same yard that you have a pH of 8, and it's simply because of how they move the soil around when they're building the house. And so getting those soil tests to determine that on a micro level within the site is incredibly important. Because you've probably been driving around, you see a pin oak that's chlorotic here, and then right next to it, it's not chlorotic. Right across the street. So that's an artifact of how we manage our soils and urban systems. And so I don't know, it's also pretty too, but then bulk density. So more or less we're talking about here is like, so in the soils we have these micro and macro pore spaces. And so the macro pore space more or less contributes to oxygen availability for your plants, and then the micro pore space can contain some of the moisture and water. When you get things like when the soil starts to get compacted, that porosity starts to get compacted or compressed or limited, that can increase the bulk density in that soil, which can cause things like the roots having issues kind of permeating into the soil to establish and or access moisture and oxygen, which are essential for trees, and also gas exchange, right? And so this bulk density is a very important consideration as well, because if you have a highly compacted soil that the roots cannot thrive in, then you might need to do something about that, and or maybe not plant a tree in that location. So, and feel free to ask questions if you have any. I'm gonna gloss over this because I'm no expert on cation exchange capacity, but this is also something you can get in your soil test as well. That for me, I really have a hard time interpreting these things. So it's another thing that will kind of be spit out in the soil assessment, right? So, and then your nutrient analysis. This is basically a guy in the field with all his personal protective equipment, collecting a soil sample, sends it here, this guy puts it in his machine, and it spits out all that information that we were just talking about. And so that'll help you, because there are certain nutrient requirements that each species will have, right? And that can be impacted by various things. And then here's that concept of soil volume. This, I think, is one of the more neglected, other than soil testing, one of the more neglected things that people don't really consider. So is anybody kind of familiar with how the location of the root system of trees in general, like, are they deep, shallow, expansive? Yeah, so they're actually usually relatively shallow and very expansive. The image that I give people is that tree roots are more like the base of the stem of a wine glass, provides that structural support. They stay shallow so that they can get oxygen, and then they're more expansive for that stability. In other words, they're not like the mirror of the top part of the tree. Like you flip the tree upside down and plug it in, and the root systems don't look like that. So some people would think that they go deep and you've got plenty of soil volume here, but you don't have ample volume for the roots to spread out. And so a tree like this, it's going to have some restrictions that could impact the health of the tree overall, and or that infrastructure, depending on how that's built and the quality of the infrastructure as those roots expand, you can see conflicts with that infrastructure, which then leads to conflict with the trees. And under conflict, these passive amazing organisms end up losing most often in the form of severing and cutting those roots. We'll see this with sidewalk expansion projects and things like that. And then several years later, those trees start to die. So knowing your soil volume and plugging that tree in there, the appropriate tree for that space, will improve the longevity for that specific situation. So it's definitely very important. So this is before we're even selecting a tree, right? We're just trying to see what's going on out in the site. And then light requirements. So this is often a very neglected aspect of tree selection as well. So shade tolerance. So each species kind of has a propensity for some level of tolerance for shade, right? From shade intolerant to shade tolerant and everywhere in between. And so understanding the species requirement, and then how, when you select that species, where it's planted in relation to other objects, structures, vegetation, and so on and so forth. And if the species predisposition for shade tolerance is impacted by those other things in the landscape, right? So if you have a shade intolerant species and you're planting it on the north side of a large structure that casts a lot of shade, that tree will languish and become suppressed and possibly chronically ill of that over time. So why don't we work it? Skip drought tolerance. I think we all know about that. And so here's this example that the shade tolerance here, where to me the quintessential shade tolerant species in Kansas, there's a lot of them, but I think this is a hackberry, Silvosox sentalis. And so this is what I kind of think of in Kansas with shade tolerance. This is that species, a native species that's really filling in the understories with lack of, with fire suppression and things of that nature. And it grows really well in low light conditions, as opposed to a bur oak, which is generally considered to be shade intolerant and will not be able to establish in those low light conditions, right? So this all informs stuff. But not only do we have the species, shade tolerance that we need to consider, but also where you're going to plant that in relation to your structure, right? So then the function. So say if you plant this on the west side of a house and it's a sugar maple or something like that, that's typically an understory tree, you might be, and you're planting that for the function of shading the west side of your house or your porch so you can drink your mimosas out here on Sunday afternoon. That tree might struggle a little bit in those high light conditions, and it might not be able to provide the function. It also might struggle or get chronic stress due to that. So planting sites. So this is just the buildings and other structures, paved surfaces. So I don't know, man, back in the mid to early nineties, so I think about these paved surfaces and structures and appropriate plantings. Sometime in the mid to early nineties, it's like really in vogue for those river birches to be planted right up next to a house, next to the walkway and the driveway. Has anybody seen this? Been familiar with this? So the growth habit of these species is like this. You know, these are the limbs drooping down. And so you end up getting a conflict with those paved surfaces, areas of ingress and egress, and also your structure, which requires expensive maintenance in terms of pruning to keep those off of those structures. And so by having that foresight with these paved surfaces and structures, you know, you're going to save yourself a lot of money, a lot of heartache and headache with the species being incompatible with the site due to its structure. And then future plans for development. So there's a lot of issues you run into this. And so if really thinking the long term with the species that you're putting and what you're going to do with that site, like, are you planning on putting an expansion on your house? Are you planning on putting a porch here, or like a sunroom, or a hot tub, or pool? You know, depending on what those future developments are on your landscape will impact the longevity and the health of that tree. Getting into those root systems damaging, having to remove the tree, having to prune the tree. So really thinking forward. So we will always ask people, you know, what, like, are you planning on having this, like, is anything going to change within this location in the next 40 years that you know of? A lot of times people don't know, but you know, if sometimes they do. Then your overhead and underground utilities. So I was actually a utility line clearance arborist for a little bit back in 08 to 10. So foreman on a truck like that. And so y'all have seen these trees in the landscapes where half of the tree is pruned up or it's walled out with a V cut. So I don't want to demonize the utility arborists, because their primary concern is the utilities and trees are secondary, right? So they do the best that they can given the objectives and scope of work that they have. But back then, like when we were doing that, often the trees were there first, then the power lines came in, which is what created the conflict. But now many of those overhead lines are already established. So being aware of like what species you're going to plant in under adjacent to those power lines can save you a whole lot of heartache in the future from having somebody come in and prune that in a way that may or may not be aesthetically pleasing or good for the tree. And so they do great work for the scope of work that they have. But also underground utilities. I would say that this is more of an issue after the trees are in the ground. So considering we've had to remove a lot of trees that somebody puts in an irrigation system, and then they trench, you know, around the critical root zone of large established trees. 10, 12 years later, the trees start to decline. Other underground utilities putting in cable, just trenching along 50% of the tree within the critical root zone can cause some issues. And so just knowing there are ways to mitigate that if your tree is already established, but then also when you're going to plant your tree, maybe consider putting those utilities underground before you plant that tree.
Critical root zone.
Critical root zone is basically the area, depending on the species, is the area, the circumferential area that the tree needs to thrive without experiencing stress or critical failure. So it depends on the species. And then the intended use of the site as well. To consider this. So I would say, like, if you were intending to plant your trees on the west side of the soccer field, you're probably not going to be planting Osage orange right next to that. And so people do goofy stuff. And likewise, you probably wouldn't plant that same species in an area of ingress and egress where those hedge apples will fall or cause conflict and tripping over and getting damage. It's my favorite species, by the way. You can boo me later, but I do love that species. So I'm not knocking it. And then the intended structure or function of the plant. So this is getting in that subjectivity. So now we're kind of getting the fun area that y'all probably like, because I'm talking about the trees themselves, not just like all the restrictions that trees have. But then we're starting to get to here, we considered all this other stuff. Why are we planting tree? Like, are we trying to plant it for shade? Are we trying to plant it for wildlife purposes? Are we trying to plant it for some beautiful flowers or fragrance? Or, you know, if you're into picking up broken limbs, planting Bradford pear and walking by the side of it. If that's something you like to do, then go for it. And then also compatibility with other vegetation, right? So sometimes there's already other vegetation there, trees and shrubs, right? Make sure that they're compatible. We have this concept of guerrilla path. You get chemical warfare amongst trees. They're not all like friends, but so some of them don't really get along very well. And so knowing this, and then planting beds. So this will be usually just making sure that those plants are compatible. And this, well, I'm gonna digress slightly about planting beds in around large, mature, established trees. Be very careful with that, right? So you very often will see where people will cut like the circumference, like around the tree and then put this metal like edging in and dig in and sever all that root system. That's not good. So this is a heads up. So I know that's not tree planting or selection, but be careful with that. And also those planting beds when you're digging or planting vegetation underneath large established trees, be careful of those roots. I've removed a lot of trees because of that. Other ground cover and flowers, turf. I'm going to gloss over that because you do not want to hear my acidic remarks about turf grass. So I will gloss over that. And so maintenance required, you're going to have transplant or planting new trees in the water. You're going to increase your success, and you're going to have a plan for that, right? You can significantly increase your success simply by irrigating or watering those trees. And I forget what the statistic is, but it's appallingly, the survivorship is appallingly low in newly transplanted trees. I'm gonna say, I'm not gonna give it a number because I don't know off the top of my head, but it's appallingly low. And a lot of that goes into either wrong tree, wrong place, but no irrigation or post-planting watering to help those trees. Trees need water. Post-planting care, so there are some things you just kind of need to do. Potentially mulching, keeping, depending on the size of the tree, keeping wildlife off of it from shooting, eating it, scraping on it. And then having a plan for ongoing maintenance. And so that would be, if we're talking about planting trees, getting some architectural structural pruning early on can save you thousands of dollars in the future, and a huge heartache, a few strategic cuts young in the formative years, like educating your kid or something like that. It can really, really have a lot of reciprocal benefit into the future. Likewise, if they're poorly pruned at a young age, you're setting it off for a world of heartache in the future. So you need to consider how you're going to maintain that after planting. And so known problems, pests, I can think of a known problem. Like anybody going to be planting ash trees or recommending that? No. Yeah, probably not. So we have known issues with that species. Poor weak wood, for a variety of reasons, we're not going to plant it, but the quintessential weak wooded poor structure tree is your Bradford pear. I don't like them anyway, but that's just an example of this. And then potentially to form surface roots, red maples, a series of other species that are grown in these compacted soils that do this. Messy flowers and fruits, I think that's unfair to the tree. That's a personal preference. None of that stuff bothers me, but it bothers a lot of people, so I put it here. And then thorns, if you kids or pets or something like that. And actually, whoa. And so don't know where those went. Yeah, so the attributes. This is where I put this at the bottom for a reason, because this really truly is entirely subjective. Like I might think something's beautiful, attractive, or not bothersome, and somebody else will not or will. And so this is your flowers, your fruit, your attractive bark. There's just so many interesting things you can choose your tree from. So after you've kind of gone through all of this decision making here, this is where you get to what most people do first. Right? And then maybe that tree doesn't even, you won't even find one within the scope of the work of what you want. You might not be able to find it. You can try it. And then here, I guess you gloss over, I'll talk about the size. Knowing the size of the tree is pretty straightforward. The mature height and spread of that tree can impact how it's going to go into the landscape. So consider that for growth habit and form as well. And so, this is a plant. So now we're looking at trees. Isn't it cool? So we can barely look at any trees. Now we're going to look at trees. And so we're going to the nursery, right? So we've gone through that whole process. We said, I want whatever this stuff is here. Just name one. What do you want to plant? Eastern redbud. Eastern redbud? Oh, the flowers are edible too. Yeah. So we're our Eastern redbud. I know these aren't Eastern redbud. And then so we're going to the nursery. We're going to try to select a species or select an individual tree. So now we know what we want. We know it's compatible. It'll fit within the space. We're going to get our Eastern redbud. It's perfect. Then you go to the nursery and you see this, and you see this. And what I would say is you have poor quality, then you have better quality, but also not great. This is pretty typical. So, and this, okay, and I want to be very clear, I'm not disparaging or being nursery, but just as an example, you're gonna see this very frequently. You're gonna have this poor structure, then you're gonna have some maintenance issues. Does anybody know why I put this as poor quality? Let's see. The split trunk, exactly. So the beauty of trees, one of the things I love about trees, are perfectly honest, pending any catastrophic intervention. They will do exactly, if you know something about that species, it'll tell you exactly what it's gonna be doing, where it's gonna be growing, how it's gonna look, and what it's gonna do. And so right here, you have this narrow branch angle, this forked branch angle. The bark is already formed on here, and as those grow in diameter, they begin to touch each other and then slightly antagonize each other, and you get some superficial kind of growth around that. But the thing is, trees are always moving, so it starts to rub back and forth. We get what we call a bark inclusion in that tree. And through that structural issue, they rub back and forth, and then sometimes you can get decay. And then that's where, if next storm or this last one, go drive around. Those are going to be the branches you see broken off of trees. That's why Bradford pear is it forms a lot of these. That's why it falls apart. So this, I would not really want anybody here to choose this. It might look interesting, but you're going to potentially have some issues. Yes. Yeah, so the question is, if you get straddled with this, then can you cut that branch to try to facilitate a central stronger branch? You can do some subordination pruning over time, and then try to push growth into whichever side seems necessary. Ideally, you select one that doesn't have this, but if you just like inherit this, there are ways to mitigate that to an extent. Let's see. And so here you got your bark inclusion. Then here you have, a central trunk. You have good scaffold distribution of scaffold branches, good branch angles. They're not in an acute angle. So that basically why that acute angle matters is like as the trees are putting on growth, trunk growth, branch growth, so on and so forth, they'll interlace and create a really strong connection there. And I don't think I have it in this presentation, but I got cross sections where you can see these V-shaped branch angles in cross section as well as good branch angles, and you'll be able to very clearly see why they're so much stronger. But why I do this as better quality and not excellent or good quality is anybody familiar with the term live crown ratio? So live crown ratio is basically the proportion of the total height of the tree to viable live foliage. So right here, you've got a live crown ratio of probably 40%. The total height of that tree, only about 40% is foliage. And the general rule of thumb, you want it to be about 75%. And what is it?
If you cut off one of the branches on the poor quality, won't it regrow?
It could potentially sprout if you overdo it, depending on the species. Yeah, potentially. Red bud, it might just, because we're planting a red bud, right? That's what we said. Yeah, it might just, depending on how much you take off of that, may or may not sprout. Over pruning will cause sprouting. So that's another thing to consider as well, right? So trees won't waste energy putting on new growth they don't need, right? That's how they feed themselves. And so going off in the sprouting, if we cut that whole thing off, that's I don't know, 40% of almost half of that tree. If the tree has a healthy enough root system, it's going to sprout like crazy, depending on the species, because it needs to photosynthesize. It needs that foliage. And so maybe depending on the species. And so, yeah. And so here they have pruned up to an excessively high live crown ratio. Why is this a problem? Because the lateral branches help feed the taper in the tree. The taper being like getting larger as you're moving down the trunk of the tree. You want to see that. And so as you excessively prune this stuff up, it reduces the amount of taper or diameter growth lower in the tree, which causes structural instability. You're also dealing with photosynthetic issues, like it's not photosynthesizing at an optimal rate, therefore reducing growth rate, reducing ability to respond to disease, and so on and so forth. And so, that's the only reason that's better quality and not good, is that live crown ratio is concerning. You have structural issues here that might not be that strong in the trunk. You're going to also potentially be languishing because it's not photosynthesis. And so what can you do about that? Try to find one that has a better. And why do they do this? This sells more trees. Like this is a psychological thing. Like this is done because people see that and they see in their mind that that's what a tree should look like. So it sells more trees. I don't know that it's like insidious or malicious, but yeah. It's a job, sell trees. So
This, I would put good quality if it had more crown down, right? So. So that's, and I'll get into a whole bunch of slides with feedbacks and things. But so say you're choosing this one. And then you've got these different considerations of the type of like stock that you're getting, like how it's grown, how it's managed, how it's transplanted. Are people familiar with these concepts? Yeah, and so typically we're dealing, so you now have, you selected your tree, your red bud, you're gonna choose this one over that one. And then you're gonna determine what that, how it was, like, the type of stock it has. We're talking about bare root, containerized trees, container grown trees, and balled and burlap. So here, the bare root style, that's just what it is. There's no soil around the roots of the trees. The most common time that you're gonna encounter bare root trees is like those Arbor Day plantings that are kind of like a little flagrant, or conservation plantings if you're planting for a riparian buffer on your property or something to just plug those into the ground. Some of the advantages, they're lightweight. You can see the root system. Some of the disadvantages is depending on how you handle them, that root system can desiccate or dry out if it's not handled properly. And they need to probably be staked as well if they're larger. Because oftentimes that root ball, you're not staking the trunk of the tree, you're trying to prevent that tree from like pivoting in the soil and falling in. And so you'll need to do some staking probably on bare root tree as well. So the advantages and disadvantages. I like, see the root systems. So the containerized, so some people get containerized with container growing trees mixed up. They can have similar issues, but they're kind of different. So this containerized is basically a tree that was growing out into the field. If you see this on this label, it says it's containerized. That means that it was grown out into the field and then it was harvested in the field and then it was put into a pot. Right? And so as long as it's not in that pot for too long, if it's like a plastic pot, that's not that big of a deal. Some of the issues you're going to deal with will be you've lost a fair amount of that root system, right? So the establishment period, you're gonna have some stress associated with that. And if it's in that pot too long, what happens if we leave them in the pots too long? Root bound. Yeah, it gets root bound. I saw a tree yesterday. I should have got a video of it. It was in the tree, it was in the ground for 25 years and it could just shake it back and forth. And so I don't know how it's alive. So containerized, so you see that means it's growing into a field, but growing in a field put into a pot. And so, but I would still look at that root system because you don't really know how long it's been in that pot. So dig around, if people are not letting you look at the root systems, I mean, that's sketchy. I mean, you should be able to get in there, dig around, look for the root system, find the root flare, like where the trunk intercepts at the root ball. You should see it flaring out, not like a phone pole. And really dig in there. And so look at those root systems. And then this is opposed, same slide, a different concept. So we have then your container growing trees. And so these are those that are put like in a plastic pot from the beginning, then they step it up to another plastic pot, another one, and then they sell it to you in a plastic pot. Or sometimes they'll put it in the field and it's confusing, but so this is basically in there. And I wish I brought this with you when I was teaching arboriculture at K-State. There was a great sample of a root system that had been kept in each successive pot. This is growing, so that girl started circling the smaller pot. The next level up, it started circling. Then the next level, and it was actually planted in the field. And then Dr. Kathy Lavis, who had that sample, she was teaching that class. That she had a picture of the tree had failed, and like because it was root bound and it failed, and then they took it out, took the soil off, and you could see like each progressive inserting grade. So you just run into issues there with the circling roots. You really, really want to be and just don't plant that stuff. Like it's gonna be.
So if it's a container grow, is that just a function of not replanting it soon enough?
Not upgrading the pot soon enough, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I've had questions in the past, like what is that time period, like how long can it be in this pot? I think it just kind of depends on the species and what the size of the pot was in relation to the root system. So, yeah, very, very common. So look for those root systems. Like I said, I've grown, like I said, I wish I paid attention in soils more and the whole, now I have to learn it on my own. But the roots are just so incredibly important. And I have so much fun just digging around in the ground, looking at roots and seeing all these defects and stuff. And sometimes it sounds like kind of like a magician. It's like, oh, because you can see it from a mile away, the bulging and stuff as they're growing, and just being able to dig in there and prove what's going on through experimentation. And so while it's tragic for the trees, it's just interesting. And so just don't plant it. And that's not vilifying the containerized trees, it's knowing you're going to need, if they're in those containers, look at them. right? Look at the root system. And then your bald and burlap trees. So these are those ones, these are the ones typically where you're going to talk to somebody and they want, I want the biggest tree at the nursery. I want 4-inch diameter tree. And then these are typically going to be what those are. So they're very heavy. Oftentimes you need specialized equipment to move them. And depending on how many you plant in a day, while I'm very kind to trees, I can tell you, it can be pretty frustrating trying to navigate one of these stubborn trees that's really heavy in the hole, and you start to kind of do unnatural things like cranking on the trunk and things like that. So someone such as myself can get upset with the tree. Just imagine if someone who didn't. So you can have some issues at establishment and planting because of how challenging they are. But the advantages are you do maintain some of that root ball, and you're going to want to do some post planting maintenance with getting the burlap and the twine. And then the tags of what the species is, and then as much of the basket as possible. Like I know there's some contention as to how much of this stuff to remove, but I can tell you, I've seen so many to remove so many trees that you leave some portion of that basket on there. And those roots can get girdled by that. You go to grind, and then how you find out is you go to grind the stump later and then you get the basket. And so getting as much of that off of there as possible, it's just like one, it's a little bit of an extra step to do, but really try to do that. And so the advantage, you can plant some larger trees, but that's kind of misleading because a lot of people want the instant landscaping, the 4-inch diameter tree that's 15 feet high or tall. They don't really realize that you could plant a tree that's 1.5 inches in diameter, with proportionally larger root system relative to the size of the tree. And there's loads of data showing this, which I should probably put that up here for you to visualize that and take my word for it. That eventually that smaller tree within reason, like if it's an Arbor Day whip, like that's just not a tree, but like it's a 1.5 inch tree based on like a 4-inch diameter tree, that will surpass, if maintained properly, surpass that larger tree in time. The post-planting establishment period is much smaller based on the diameter of the tree, more or less, than the larger diameter tree. So there's more room for error in that larger diameter tree. Like you have to maintain it longer to get it to establish. So it's going to have that transplant shock for much longer and not grow, and then that smaller tree can surpass that. Now, if the larger tree does survive, eventually it evens out once it establishes. But the establishment period is significantly longer for those larger trees, which to me just introduces all kind of error.
I really have a question, just a comment. I remember years ago buying trees that were burlap like that, and they definitely told me you can plant it in the burlap, and the roots will grow through it, and then it's just not true.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that over the years, and there was some prevailing recommendations, but and it also, they were talking about also whether synthetic versus natural. Synthetic clearly won't, but degrade, but yeah, just take the stuff off, take it off. It's great. Yeah, you hit that stuff with a stump grinder. It's not very fun. Yeah, so this is the basic things that you're gonna run into, like are out in the tree. So whatever one we choose, and just take a picture of this. Now that I see this up here, this is a mess. You can just take a picture of this, but it's basically talking about based on these type of stock conditions, like if you need to stake those trees, right? So in the BMPs, it's just stake when necessary. Like you don't have to stake everything, but you should stake it if it requires it. And then just to be clear, is like we're not like staking the trunk of the tree, we're trying to keep the root ball stable in the front, so it doesn't fall. And then so each of these different production methods, I suppose, will have different requirements for staking.
How long do you think the stakes?
Depends, right? So I learned that answer. So I was at the Arborist Consulting Academy, and we had a whole day on trees in the law, and we had this arborist lawyer, and I like every answer he had. Right. No, I wouldn't think so more than like or so. In checking them, because if that tree is real, depending on how they're staked, as that tree grows in diameter, you don't want the stakes to girdle the tree. All you're doing is getting that root system established, and so you check on it. And then just making sure that it's not girdling it, and you don't want to leave it too long because then you're impacting taper growth. Like the trees need to move, they'll get what we call response growth, so the trunks need to move to be able to put on structural growth onto those trees. So if they remain static for years, if it doesn't girdle the trees, you'll take them off and they'll flop over. So it depends. Yeah. I learned that from the lawyer. So, and again, just take a picture of this one. But you know, survival after planting, with these various, production methods there. So, and they've got some stuff now like production methods. I think the city, Paul, you know, the city did the gravel bed thing, or they get started. They've got gravel beds where they're like putting trees in these gravel beds to get these root systems, they're putting them for your popping up, so they're like bare root trees.
Pulled out, planted like a area for me.
Yeah,
And then when I got in, this is back in the seventies, we planted a lot of area too.
bigger one.
Did not have a fever to store in. We have a bush.
Yeah.
The city is alive and you couldn't. They buy inch and a half of 2 inch very trees and then they do a big service project.
Yeah.
I don't remember the species.
Yeah.
They use or. If they're still, I don't know if it's still doing it.
Yeah, that's really good with the cool guy. One of the additional things of the larger barrel trees is the
Yeah.
roots desiccating or drying.
The professor pointed out, they did it. Whatever city in New York that is, they did a big tree project and they put gravel there.
Mm.
Trees that are drainage, and they planted every tree and they have a really high.
Yeah, getting the root systems for just I got another seeing where they pluck them out and sometimes the root systems. Amazing. Thank you for sharing, Paul. But yeah, so this is just similar stuff of those production methods and things probably of these slides, I apologize. And now, so now what I've kind of gravitated toward personally, are these fabric containers. Does anybody have experience with these? Okay, well, what's really cool about them is they're these fabric containers, and so this is usually when you pluck those out of those fabric containers, that's what the root systems look like. So they more or less air prune the roots as they hit that fabric, and then basically they'll just kind of stop there and get these really fibrous root systems. And I've had a lot of success with these, and some of the best trees. I don't know, I'm not trying to advocate for anything, but some of the best trees that I've, well, I guess I'm private now, so I guess I can advocate. But in all seriousness, there's these, through Cat Nursery, they have this plant right program where they're using these plastic, or these bags to grow them in. These root systems are incredible. And I know I planted quite a few of these trees and they're doing really well. And so, you know, you can start looking into some of these other methods as well. In these bags, and those are probably the only trees that I personally will put my name on, not them specifically, but trees with this kind of root system, and I wouldn't be planting any of those personally. That doesn't mean you shouldn't, I just don't.
You remove those, aren't you?
You remove, and they're not reusable, and I was trying to think of an argument of why it might be more sustainable, but I don't know the material on the bag, so I don't know if that's any different in terms of the energy to produce that and dispose of it as plastic. I don't know for that. But yeah, so like after 14 days after transplanting, they pluck this out after that bag, and you can see that root system. It is pretty significant. That's a really grainy picture. Important considerations at planting, the size at planting, like that. I've seen some cool stuff, like look at that. So there's going to be some really significant challenges in getting that tree to survive post-planting maintenance, just handling it with cranes and stuff like that. I had the opportunity, there was I think it's the grand champion, not just maybe the state champion of Illinois at Purdue campus, Lafayette, Indiana. There's a smoke tree. There's a champion. Is anybody familiar with smoke trees? This was the champion smoke tree. It's about as unimpressive as you would think, but it's still really big for a smoke tree. Maybe it's like that size, but they transplanted this tree all the way across Canada. Of course, it's like declining a little bit, I think, at least last time I saw it, but they spent the time. So if you're going to move those really large trees, they're usually just very important trees. We get asked a lot to somebody's going to do construction. Can we help them transplant a tree like that? And it's got to be pretty sentimental to be able, sentimental or some sort of value to take the expense to do that. It can be very expensive. There are people that specialize in this, but it's possible. Tactical, it depends. So the irrigation capabilities or site drainage, weed control, mulch management, and things like that. So this is kind of a shout out to my buddy Aaron Yoder. He runs the conservation tree program there at Kansas Forest Service, and so he does a really great job. But we'll get through that here, but so we'll get to that at the end, but he just has an adorable sticker. And so here, this is Kim Baumberger. She, this was, when I was teaching arboriculture, we were doing the tree planting unit and stuff, so she came in and assisted with that. So we're talking about a lot of this stuff. So you got this tree with this, with the bag, the root systems, it has some structural issues associated with it. This is how, how we get into planting, and I've got more slides talking about physically plugging them into the hole. But you can see kind of some of this stuff. These are just some of those production methods there, like those containers, small containers, everybody's seen those. This is at the Kansas Forest Service. What's really interesting, you talk about planting diversity, one of the things that comes to mind when you say diversity, usually at the family level as opposed to the species level, because a lot of those pests and pathogens are more akin to getting, the same genus of trees. So you do familial diversity, but if you change one species, like in this whole system here, he was talking about how challenging it was to go from their production methods initially were for windbreak trees, for eastern red cedars, pines, and things of that nature. And then just to add like bur oaks or a new species significantly changed this entire operation because of the light requirements for this one species, light requirements, potting requirements, stratification of the seeds, so on and so forth. And so we want diversity, but like it's just very interesting. So this is kind of what that'll look like at that production level. Especially we're talking about container grown trees. And these will often go right out in the field and planted small, but often they're started kind of like this. So I think it's just good to lend perspective of what those production methods look like. Some more planting. I'm not a big fan of spruce trees here, but there's just some more planting here from the arboriculture class. And then this here, this is an amazing picture. I've got the citation down here if you're interested in it. Here's more of those growing roots that we're talking about. Look for those things. Look for these, look for all of this up here, your growing roots at the base of the tree. Your damage to the trunk of the tree. So that can also tell you how the trees were handled, right? Which can inform more about the production methods and kind of maybe the culture place growing trees. So you got damage to the trunk here, broken branches, some kind of stunted foliage, codominant stems, wilting, all of that kind of stuff. We'll be looking at that when you're physically picking the specific tree. Because all these can compound in a bad way over time. I like that picture. Root defects. They can occur regardless of the production method. So while I kind of tend to give container grown trees a hard time, if it's done properly, it works just fine. On the main roots, yes. And so the main roots, they can be difficult to correct. Like if you've got this here at planting, like that's going to be very challenging, if impossible to correct. Because they will have a propensity to kind of recircle after you prune it. I've killed a lot of trees trying to prune the roots. I'll tell you what. And so that young tree before planting them. And so, that can be very, very, very challenging to deal with. It can have a significant impact, those growing roots of root defects, significant impacts on the performance of the tree, languishing growth, foliar issues, and then after 20 years, if it survives that long, structural issues. And they're often not visible and become evident. So what I would encourage each of you to do is go out and dig around in the soil and look at tree roots. Like go down, you'll go down and look in those root bed, that limited soil volume there in those planting beds. You're gonna get to look at a lot of growing roots and stuff. Like it's nobody's fault, but it's a good option. You can go downtown, walk down there, look at the roots, feel that's what you're doing, and you inform them. Go look at more roots. That's what I do for fun. And just don't, so this is why, so for us, why I say this is so challenging is we've been trying to build our tree planting program at Lawrence Arborists for a while. And we just find it so difficult to find trees that people want that need all of this stuff, and then they don't have all of these defects already. We can spend hours just like looking for the right tree, and at that point, it just doesn't make sense for us financially to help people with that. But those plant right trees, I'm optimistic about those. So we'll see, the jury's out, but just don't plant those. We know what's going to happen. We know what's going to happen with those trees, with the root issues, the root of the issue. So here's just more of that, right? circling roots and it's all avoidable. So that's why that's like they're at the nursery, pulling that out. And so, I mean, I've gotten in trouble a few times just pulling trees out of pots before and I'm still allowed back to those places. But I will get in there and look at those. 'Cause it's like, it's that important to you, and truly, like, even if you prune these off, they will try to recircle again. And then the planting depth. So another thing that you'll see is oftentimes, even in those pots, they're gonna be too deep already in the pot. And so when we get to I don't know if we got time, I don't know if we're out of time, but if we get to the tree planting portion of how we're planting trees, you don't want to plant them too deep, but oftentimes you're already at a disadvantage just when you pick the thing up from the nursery that's already 8 inches beneath grade in the pot. And so you want to get in there and reveal that. So I think that's maybe why it's really good stuff. But look at that root flare, because you could already have a tree that's too deep before you plant it, then too deep again on accident. Now it's 8 meters of below this one.
It's a strategy they do. They'll get the smaller pot, put it into the bigger one, and just fill the soil.
Yeah.
Right before they ship it.
Yep.
So you pull the thing out, this isn't a 5-gallon bucket, this is a 2-gallon bucket.
Yep. They're upsizing and soil gets put on top of it. But yeah, I'll always be like looking for that root flare thing. Sometimes you'll have grafts and things that can make it challenging for some people, like if it's a cultivar and it's grafted, you'll have some bouldering and things like that. People always ask about that. But yeah, this is that thing. This one survived. Tree risk and health are related, but they're not a one-to-one. So this tree could have been perfectly lush and green, but had these girdling roots for 15 years, 20, however old that tree is. And then you get enough force applied to that and not enough lateral, stabilization from those roots and then the top of the root. And so this has been like that for a very, very long time. The result of growing roots from plant growing production. Yes, ma'am.
You just cut off certain roots
You
or straighten them out.
So it like depends, but like if you have smaller minor girdling roots, like I'll prune those. And if it's a smaller tree, they can take to cutting more roots, like a younger tree. And they can often take that abuse a little bit more, but like the pictures that I showed where they're very like already around the trunk, you're gonna be at a distinct disadvantage pruning those and just don't select.
Really big roads.
My experience, those that are as bad as the pictures I showed will continue to kind of insert.
So they remember that growth pattern?
I can't speak to the memory, but I don't know the, and I don't know the mechanism to why that would be, but that's just been my experience. So you can prune some of those growing roots with it when they're proportionally small enough to do so, because otherwise you can also destroy the tree. Like I've done. So, not a client's tree, I've never done that. It's my own. And so these kinked roots, so there could be an obstruction in there, or maybe handling or moving or upgrading that in the top. The root gets kinked in there and you get some of these issues. And then this is just like a cross section of more of these circling roots. The reason I know this is a review, but this is so common. This is so common. Like we're a tree preservation company. We remove a lot of trees that just have girdling roots, and it's really tragic. And so, just keep looking at that. So this is why I'm this layer of learning for reasons, really hammering on the roots. And so then here we get into these root balls. Oh, when you're inspecting root balls, they should be really firm and not like falling apart or crumbling. And so, get in there and just dig around in the roots and, really get your hands dirty. And so the roots shouldn't be separating from the soil. They should be firm, they should be intact, and so on and so forth. Poor quality, better, it's still poor quality. So you're getting it heaving. You have some issues here with the bending and the heaving in the soil here with phosphorus. So you can also do that like gently. You can kind of put some foraging on the trunk of the tree gently to see what's going on beneath the surface. So there, your good quality here is pivoting with the soil as opposed to. they're just gonna see that. A little bit. And so here, you've got a root bound tree, just too many roots are on the outside of the, on the outside, they may turn into a circling girdle root situation. You've all seen this. Then there are different strategies. I've seen people have an array of different approaches to this for these deal with these root bound trees like this. Some people will take their knife and kind of crisscross along. The last one that I heard was cutting it into a square. Cutting the root ball into a square, or sorry, cutting this root system into a square. And because I think it's just an easier way to stop them from circling, so instead of just like dicing along here, they'll just cut it into a square. I've heard that. I've never done it personally. I just kind of like dicing along. Yeah, so you're just cutting along the edge of the root ball. Yeah, so.
In a situation like that, how deep into the root balls?
You can kind of get your fingers in there and look and see. Usually it's pretty apparent. It could be deep, yeah, it could be deep like that. That example I gave about, circling it with an excessive pot. You could have growing roots over here and then you could have more internally. And if you're trying to select that tree and it's like a really bad growing roots internally, just if possible, unless you've already like signed the check, just don't select that tree. Here's some examples here. Those are some big, that's that instant landscape in there. But yeah, you can see the roots are already bulging over the top of the pot. This is very, very common stuff. Root ball relationship, the caliper, the height relationship, which, whoa. Sorry, wow, it looks a lot different on my computer at home. So, but yeah, so your root ball and your caliper height, all of that kind of makes sense where you have proportionally the root ball size is in relation to the caliper of what would be the diameter of that tree. This is that breakdown of that. So that's might be another opportunity to take a picture and save yourself a headache from staring at it too long. But yeah, so there's relationships between the root systems and then the trunk, the diameter growth of that tree as well. And the trunk and branch structure, so this is super important. Here, just going over this again, poor quality. You got this forking branch. You're gonna see this all over the place. Like go to the nursery today or wherever, Home Depot, wherever, and just like look at this stuff. So you got what I would consider as poor quality. You've got low forks, tight branch angles, bad no aspect rate or no live crown ratio. All of this kind of stuff happening, will kind of defect there. And then you've got your best quality, your good scaffold branches, and then your good quality. So sometimes you just have good execution. So it's kind of like you might, if you really need to plant a tree, try not to do this, but those might be your only options. Maybe go somewhere else, and that might be your only option. And then you might have to acquiesce with the good quality as opposed to excellent quality. But yeah, so that would be downgraded because of those type branches. So dominant central leader, and then there's also caveats now, like if you're growing fruit trees or something like that, or you have some specific objectives that you would desire these, but this is more for like landscape shade trees that you're going to be planting in the landscape as opposed to other production methods. So these two are more leaders. These are things that have known issues, known maintenance issues into the future through pruning that we as a tree service, I guess it keeps us in business because of all of these, but at the end of the day, it's not ideal. You have to come back and fix those things so those branches don't fail. Awesome. So for me, if the tree could express an opinion, it would probably want to keep those lower branches as long as they're not becoming co-dominant, like not becoming excessively large in relation to the trunk. But leaving those lower branches is totally fine, as long as it doesn't impact your use of the area and the use of that tree. And so you see a lot of people thinking that you need to prune the branches up. But like say pin oaks, that'll happen quite frequently. People will prune those up thinking that it's for tree health. That's simply for aesthetics or functionality and it's just human uses. So you leave those low branches, for one, you won't have to mow underneath that tree when it kills the grass. Two, in all seriousness, though, but the two, it still has those lateral branches that are photosynthesizing and creating structure. Now, some trees, if it doesn't need them, a pin oak, for example, those low branches, it might self-prune. It might actually just kind of be done with those branches. They'll die back, and that's just naturally what happens. But in regard to do you need to prune the trees up? Not necessarily, not really. That's usually for us specifically, for people. And that's really what an arborist job is, to be able to help trees and humans coexist without too much frustration. Have that tree be as healthy as possible while letting humans enjoy the activities of their infrastructure around them. So absent of humans, an arborist wouldn't be necessary at all. Like, so there's that. So that's kind of sad, but yeah, really like out in the woods and stuff, it doesn't really matter, they'll do what they do. It's simply because of mitigating conflict between trees. So we're conflict mitigators, right? Again, getting back into this. So this is that tree, kind of got them out of order, apologize. So here, then if you've got this structure that we're dealing with here, you can then kind of mitigate some of that at planting, if that tree's healthy enough. So we can establish, do some reduction cuts here, cutting back maybe some lateral buds to get that more central leader to what we call subordination pruning. So we start pruning this here and here to more or less push growth into there. So we don't get that co-dominance or that competing lateral branch. So you can do that at planting as well. So like if you get one of those poor or good quality trees or poor quality trees, you can kind of do some stuff about it. The one no-go for me is sterling roots. Like that's a no-go. The other structural stuff you can kind of mitigate, deal with. And so here you got your good quality again. You got your poor quality here, and then I think if I did this right, so we're talking about the branches, the proportional size of the diameter of the branches here, and how they're distributed along the trunk as opposed to clustered right here. Nice. And then I hope that I've got. Oh, so then like say if you end up getting stuck with this branch or this tree here, you can do some pruning to kind of like reduce the competition between the branches. Now you don't want to do too much at planting, but you can mitigate some of that stuff. Sometimes you just deal with what you've got. Oh, and then also realizing that so in regard to raising, sorry, this is a good, in regard to raising the trees or the branches, also, that's also during the future use of that site. And so I think of stuff like trees that are planted adjacent to like a bus stop or something like that. Those trees, like with enough foresight, you can keep those lower limbs smaller through pruning, knowing that eventually you're going to remove them. They're temporary branches. And so at planting, a tree, if it's this big and your lowest permanent limb is going to be 15 feet off the ground, you have pruning strategies to be able to do that to help that tree grow and thrive, knowing that all of those are going to be basically everything that exists other than the trunk is not a permanent branch to those trees. So that's like kind of having that foresight of what the use of the spaces and then planning the post planting maintenance like that. So lower branches, they can help the root system, help the trunk grow and taper and in diameter. And then it also protects the trunk by forming a barrier to mechanical injury. Things like sun-solved, frost cracking, stuff like that. And or animals, right? So one of the things where I was working at the Forest Service doing conservation tree plantings, we've had deer rubbing on trees. Some of the trees, they could leave the lower branches and they wouldn't seem to mess with them much. And then a fun fact is also that if you tend to leave that one tree, like if you have 100 trees you're planting and they're rubbing on one or two trees, leave those trees, so it's kind of come back to the same trees. I noticed we've made the mistake of removing those trees and then moved the other trees. So sometimes you can have a sacrificial plant. Some more poor quality. Does anybody know what this is? This tree? I hope it's dead. Yeah, I hope it's dead. That's a bad thing. So you got these co-dominant stems here. You can see now, like that's where you'll get those structural issues, branch failures, extremely common, and can be mitigated either through selection, not planting that, and or pruning when they're young.
One big pruning at the bottom.
We call that a one-cut basal pruning. Yeah, no, that was like one of the last things I was involved with when I was at the Forest Service was the assisting with the band, so to speak, with that. So that was pretty good, results in my opinion. These V-shaped narrow branch angles here, but like I said, they're just not strong. You're not getting that interlacing of the growth, and they don't fall apart. Oftentimes you can mitigate this by not selecting those pretty bark inclusions. And so other important considerations, staking. So here you can actually get physical injury based upon how the trees are staked, and if they're kept too long or staked too rigidly, you're going to be getting some of this injury to the trunk, girdling, or the trees will just maybe not survive. Wrapping trees with canopy. Oh, that's a huge mistake for me, because I'm sorry, the crown, uniformity in the crown. So I'm a huge proponent to maintain the distinction between crown and canopy. Crown being one tree, canopy a collection of two or more crowns. So that's a big error for me. So but make sure that the crown is uniform and full. Look at how the tree, like when you're selecting, like how were those pruning cuts made? Were they properly done? You know, to be able to you can tell how they were managed. Your seed or propagule source. So this comes back to that idea of the provenance, the genetics of the tree we're dealing with. It could be a native species, but the genetics are of the different geographic region, and thereby might not be as well suited for the particular location. Insects and disease infestation, some of my favorite stuff to deal with. Trunk and injury, you know, these are when you're still looking at these trees in the nursery. Just pretty stuff you can visibly see. The tree, yeah, forgot about this one. So basically here, you know, if you're going to select these trees, some of these things can actually be hiding defects. So take it all off and look at it. Ask consent first. But no, really, you can see potentially there could be some serious defects underneath, stuff like that. So take it off, look at it. The foliage size, the color, is it consistent with what you expect that species to look like? You know, is it chlorotic already at the nursery, or is it supposed to look chlorotic, right? There's some varieties in cultivars that have that variegated foliage, and if you didn't know, you might think that it was sick or something, or nutrient deficient. So is that size and color of the tree you're selecting at the nursery consistent with what you would expect it to be? Is there any dieback in the crown of the tree? And then the presence of stakes, you know, looking at those, sometimes they can be like kind of left in there and then starting to kind of, the tree can some stuff that gets some issues with that from rubbing and things like that. And then this is that idea of crown uniformity. So you can look at it. So fortunately, when we're selecting them, they're smaller. So you can get an above ground view, you know, and then your side view, your top view, side view, see how that's all distributed. So looking from all around how those branches, how that crown is distributed. And then here's just different options of, you know, the tree that's like less uniform, right? And so look at all of these things, this crown uniformity. I got it right there. I'm like, whatever, I'm solid 33%. So quality of old pruning cuts, like are the trees you're selecting, do they have these old flush cuts here? Are they leaving stubs? What's the wound response look like on those pruning wounds? You know, is there enough vitality in that tree to really be closing up those wounds? And you know, so you'd be looking at those things. So how is entertainment also matters as well. And then here's just a typical kind of proper pruning cut, where this is no, that's a flush cut, and then this is about where you put that based on that branch bark ridge or that branch collar. A lot of chemistry is there to help with wound coat. You don't want to be cutting into the trunk of the tree. So you're looking for those proper cuts, the wound response. It'll tell you something about culture to help you in the state trees. Foliage. What's this? Well, I mean, what's the condition of concern of it? Yeah, it's actually kind of pretty. And then your seed or propagule source. Where are the genetics? Where are the origins of that tree? This stuff gets shipped all around the nation, right? Like, so you need to know where that species, although it's native, where that comes from, in order to have optimum success. And of course, climate and things, you're just learning the myriad of issues associated with that, but knowing that the genetic origin is not just the species, is also. The staking, so this is just looking at that. Up against the trunk of the tree. Now, oftentimes you're gonna see bulges, like where that flagging tape is, it's left on there too long and it starts to bulge and you're seeing girdle and starting to form. So here's what I would say a quality oak relative to other trees. But the issue here, why would I downgrade this one? The live crown ratio is too small, but this might be the best option here. So, and younger trees can kind of off that from that. So you got kind of more of a quality oak tree there. One codominant or one dominant trunk, branches evenly spaced, crown is full and uniform. So just assuming we did a 360 view, probably not gonna be able to look at that one from above, but then we've got a quality limit. We get a little bit of codominance, and then again, so again, why would I downgrade this one here? The LCR is still another 40%, right? See how common it's?
Yeah.
But other than that, you've got decent lateral structure, one dominant trunk, not a lot of taper because it's been excessively clean. But it might be the best one. Small branches spaced evenly along the dominant trunk. This is getting a little bit codominant. This would be something that I would probably really like subordinate at, so reduce the diameter break on that. Half planting. And then again, we've got the trunks, we've got this branch spacing, but the live crown ratio is excessively small, concerningly small. You're gonna see this. So just move that there. But it's not as marketable. So one dominant trunk, you've got your spacing of your branches. The trunks tape, I don't know if I'd consider, they taper better than the other trees. So some of your elms, so you're getting into some of these ideas of known pests and pathogens of trees. So a lot of the Dutch elm disease resistant elm trees, stuff like that. Some of those have a myriad of structural issues just naturally in their natural growth habits. But this is kind of an example of a better quality elm. But again, the live crown ratio, see how hard it is to find these things? Like, oh, and then what time are we good on time or am I working? 10 minutes, okay. Is everybody thoroughly excited to put the trees in the ground now? Okay. We're putting them in the ground now. Promise you, I'd tell you how to do that. So tree installation and establishment, right? So we've done all of that stuff, and I've told you all the problems we run into. And then there's another problem that we can do. Don't plan it properly. So let's do it the right way. See, look at this. He's actually, or this person's actually like cutting the basket off. And so first thing you're gonna do, you find your planting site, it's appropriate, right species, do all this stuff, get the best quality tree you can. You're gonna, before you dig the hole, you're gonna call in your locates. Call before you dig, right? 811, the dig safe. You don't want to hit underground utilities, safety reasons, also can be very expensive. And so always call. This is my little disclaimer to try to deflect any responsibility should somebody hit a power line. But yeah, but seriously, it's really do this for safety. And then so we've got our planting hole, right? And so the most common issue that I see with improperly planted trees is, what do you think it is?
Oh, it's too small.
Too small? Too deep. Too deep. People are planting trees too deep. And so, here's a whole bunch of, words basically you want it 2 to 3 times the diameter. The more the better, right? The more space you can kind of get for those roots to establish. I would advocate for that. The key is you don't want to go too deep, and if anything, truly, I would err on slightly less than 2. You want it just right? A grade where that root flare is there, but you don't want to go too deep. Yes, sir. So what happens? So the root systems they require oxygen and moisture and a various variety of other things. Once you go too deep, those roots are getting into an area that might become anaerobic, right? And then so your root system might languish. In some cases, especially in Kansas, with a lot of our clay soils, you might then, if they're too deep, you get some girdling root issues. And then also you can potentially get some decay at the trunk of the tree, like the basal area of the root flare of the tree from just being buried. So if you pull the soil back from trees that have been buried too deep, it'll be very moist there. And I've often seen that you can end up getting some decay associated with that in those areas. And so a variety of different things, so. Yeah, and so you want to be able to see this flare here, not like a phone pole, you want to see that root flare, see it flaring out. And if you don't, yeah, oh, nice, love this. Yeah, so look at that, so this is before planting, so we mentioned this earlier. So they've got the tree, they're ready to go, put it in the ground, you're not seeing the root flare. You're seeing it's already 5 inches too deep into the soil. So now then if you plant that another few inches below the soil, you're, 15 inches below, so 10 inches, in that, in which case there's not, those roots are going to really suffer.
Okay, take that 5 years ago.
If somebody gave that to me, I would be kind of sad and upset, but then I would turn an obstacle into an opportunity and try to like expose that root flare, and hopefully not damage any roots along the way of the trunk. So that'd also be frustrating when you try to take it off. But really just, yeah, you want to try to expose it, like you don't want to put that in the ground like that. Absolutely. So this is very common.
Square hole versus round hole, I was just gonna ask that.
Oh, for planting?
Yeah.
I don't think that the tree would care, to be honest, like, so the question of square hole versus round hole at planting. I would say that it's the shape of the hole is less important than getting an adequate amount of space for it. So if if the hole is too small, whether it's square or round, you're gonna run into the same issues. If it's of an adequate size, I don't foresee, nor do I know. There could be data out there looking at the relationship between square and round holes. I don't see physiologically, like, unless it's heavy clay soil wide open. As long as it's of a suitable size.
I would discourage. Early, circling.
It could, I think you'd be dealing with some clay soil, because whether it's square or round, if the soil is appropriate, those roots should be able to penetrate into the parent material regardless. But if you did, I would think if you did it into heavy clay soils, you're just gonna probably run into that issue anyway. So that's me saying I don't know. But no, that's, yeah. I'm not too proud to say when I know something. No, that's very, very interesting. I personally don't do square holes. But yeah, there could be something there, so. Yeah. So, yeah. And so here we've got, your planting depth, you determine your roots are, evenly spaced. And just kind of, this is that lateral view of that. And your planting hole here, and this is from a publication, this is another Forest Service publication too, so I can send that out as well. You've seen it before. So this is kind of how you dig. This would be much better for outside digging the holes. I think that would be a lot more romantic in this regard. But so basically, you're digging your holes. You're getting it your width, 2 to 3 times wider than the root ball. So that's like that width. Now, whether square or round, I unfortunately don't have an answer for that right now. But you're going to want to be getting it at least that width. And I tend to kind of go a little wider, to be perfectly honest, especially in heavy clay soils, which we deal with a lot. And your depth is measured by the root flare, where the trunk flares out at the base. And then you also want to make sure that your drainage isn't an issue as well. This is really common. And so I don't know many people that do this, but you can dig your hole and fill it up with water and see how well it drains. Yes.
And I will admit that before I became a master gardener, I planted a tree. And it would, enough space around it. But then I put in, I don't think it was pine soil, but it was pine soil, but it was really loose soil. And all the rest around is clay. And so whenever it would rain, it would Yeah, and so anything I planted there. So I think we have.
Yeah, yeah, that's good, good thing to share that idea of the first water table, like bringing in exotic or, soil material outside of the parent material that's there. In excess can cause some issues with your trees, so. But yeah, so you might have some drainage issues, so this might be something you might not plant for you guys.
Cypress.
Cypress, yeah, one of my favorite, I got one in my front yard. The year after it's planted, a buck, so I lived by Birchland Park, a buck came and rubbed the whole half of the tree off. Almost broke the top out. And so you're basically loosen up, spread it out. Your growing medium is down here. That's how you handle that root ball. Then being very careful holding the trunks, right? Like I typically advocate for handling the root ball and not like holding it by the trunk. But you're gonna be able to get in there and get it evenly distributed in this hole. Here's just an example of folks doing balled and burlap. And those are heavy. Has anybody has planted balled and burlap trees themselves? It's is it fun? Would you say it's fun, Paul? Yeah.
Figure out how to do it.
I don't find much
You
to
cut
it.
the bottom of the page off first,
Mhm.
and when you get on the farm where you reach there, then you measure that, big hole, and measure your hole, and you roll it in the hole.
Exactly. Yeah.
You roll it, picking up,
Yeah.
and then cut the rest of the basket and spray it off,
Yeah.
but you could now keep them both together.
But there's all those strategies for it too. And then you're planting depth, like, I don't know what you do or you have done with those, is I'll usually dig the hole and I'll put my shovel across the hole and then kind of put it in there to practice and make sure that it's still there. So, some more planting, then you're doing your backfill. So if your soil is heavy clay or pure sand, you might consider adding some organic matter. In general, I'm using the parent material of the site that I'm planting in, but I'm also very picky about where I plant trees too. So if you must plant at a less than desirable site, then there's some ways to kind of improve your success there with organic material, but within reason. You don't want to put you don't want to put an entire hole full of compost, in there. And then this, some of these rings like this, aesthetically, I think people like them, but also this is to discourage the mulch. So this is mulching after planting to discourage the piling of the mulch up around the trunk of the tree. I don't do this a lot, like I might kind of put it further out, but that can, help in various ways, but in general, I don't think it's needed. It's more to encourage, I think psychologically, hey, get her away from the trunk of the tree. Perhaps you get some benefits with moisture retention and things like that. But you'll be mulching not in excess. And staking, again, there are different philosophies of how to stake. But really the overall concept of staking is that you're stabilizing the root ball in the tree from pivoting in the hole, as opposed to stabilizing the trunk. A lot of people think they're stabilizing the trunk, it's the root system. So there can be options for staking low on the tree. So I'll do this, and it depends on the site as well. Like if I were planting, somewhere at a school or something like this where kids are running around, I'd probably plant lower and then get rid of that. So there's less of key posts sticking up they're gonna run into. So you also have these, options as well, but you're stabilizing that root system. That might be a sufficient way to stake as well. And some folks might advocate for putting, stakes on either side and staking up a little bit higher. I tend to prefer to stake lower so you can get more movement in the trunk and the response curve. And then, in regard to the type of stakes and how you do it, it also depends where you are, right? So some of those T-posts can help prevent vandalism and things like that, and or protect the trees from lawnmowers as well. So you might see you do 2 stakes, maybe 4 stakes, just to keep the lawnmowers from running. So protecting your asset after it's done. And then you're mulching. So mulching is just an incredible thing to do for trees for several reasons. And this is probably not new information to anybody here. The color of the mulch doesn't really matter. It's kind of subjective. The regular arborist mulch is totally fine. Just a few inches is totally adequate. And to me, as much of that root system as you can protect with mulch from competition with things like turf fescue, That's usually what I would recommend to people. When people ask how much should I mulch, they say, like in terms of the circumference around the tree, not the depth. It's how much mulch do you have? You know, how much fescue do you want to get rid of? Because they occupy the same root system, like that's all tongue in cheek, but it's very true. They're occupying and competing in that same root system. And so eventually, once the trees get established, once they're large, they start to win. With these newly planted trees, that fescue is a significant form of competition for that tree to establish. So, you know, as much of that area that we can dedicate for the tree roots will be better for the tree. So, and there's different times, you know, you've got your organic or inorganic mulch. I tend to not advocate for inorganic mulch. Just because for me personally, it's kind of a pain to deal with and work around. You know, a lot of your organic mulch is much better, typically just arborist wood chips. And then, you know, 2 to 4 inches, keeping it off the trunk of the tree. I got some amazing pictures of trees that are just volcano mulch to an absurd degree. And then this is probably, I don't know if this is a tenant probably of the Master Gardeners too, do not volcano mulch. You probably get to say that several times a year to people, but it is serious. It can cause some issues there. And stabilizing some more trunk stuff here. You know, so they're kind of stabilizing it higher. I tend to prefer lower. Paul, did you have a preferred staking method for you? You plant a lot of trees.
Yeah, it depends on the site. I have points like, that we use like 3 feet hose.
Yeah.
Right? Hose, water and hose and that. We didn't do it real tight, but
Yeah.
one thing, if you're in a place where you've got the guy that you put the 30,000 foot more, 80,000, make sure that you have your stakes within the mall.
Mhm.
Because the stakes mag is safely.
Yeah.
We're gonna share the 300.
Yeah.
And then you can take the wires off of the growing trees usually, but you can also leave stakes in for a little bit longer than it takes.
Yeah, I've seen that as well.
Around it, because you discourage deer.
Yeah.
And, you know, the deer are, it seems like a dollar oaks, you know, but you notice that.
Well, I don't know, like species, usually, I don't know.
They got the oaks more,
Yeah.
and this year, I saw a tree that was deer.
Oh.
That field was completely.
Yeah.
But it was like 3 blocks from the river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, staking can provide multiple purposes, stabilizing the root ball, but also protecting it from other activities. But then also having a plan to remove those stakes in time. So you can leave them there. I can give an example of a walnut plantation in Donovan County where they left the stakes to protect it from deer for too long, and the trees grew around the stakes and then maybe useless in terms of marketability. So you gotta have a plan for removing that stuff. Like that, like this. And then just protecting them, you know, it's kind of what Paul was saying. This was a really extreme example, but probably some issues with soil volume. But you know, protecting those trees after planting them, because you already went through this whole like mental journey to figure out, you know, they could plant a red bud and then doing it properly, selecting the right and doing it properly, putting it in the ground, and then just be awful if it got vandalized or damaged by wildlife or something like that. So being able to protect them. And this is mostly just tongue in cheek here, because like that's so extreme. But you know, but it is serious. You do need to protect all that.
Go to Europe.
Yeah.
They do more than that for their new trees.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And but it's not. I mean, they're like $300, $400 trees.
Yeah.
$50 worth of protection is not a bad investment.
Right.
I was struck by how much more they do to protect their new trees than we do.
You know, it's really, really important. Inspiring, in fact. Yeah, and then so this just kind of summarizes this, and like that, this is the thought process. And then down there is where you're gonna end up like selecting your tree. So I think our red bud has a pretty good likelihood of success. If we take the stakes off in time. And we continue to water it throughout the next several years. And so I hope that was helpful. And but it's just really, I do like just go through this process. So right here, this is just all, no, you should just have a list of all these trees for this hardiness zone. And then it starts to get more specific with the soils. So that's so like big thing of trees that grow here and then the different types of soil.
How about bark protection, sun scald and critters? You want white or black or fabric or?
So the question was, how about bark protection from things like sun scald and critters? And does the color matter? And what would I recommend? Or you didn't ask the recommendation, but I'm assuming. And so I would say that me personally, if I'm going to be doing bark protection for something like sun scald, the seasonality of it would be more important than maybe the color, but I typically will have like wrap around it or something. But I don't do a lot. So, yes. So our tree house is bad for trees, so that is a great question. So depending on how they're made, could be pretty bad for the tree. But if they're made in consideration of the tree, like not nailing into, they're kind of building it around the tree with room for that tree to move and grow in diameter, it'd probably be fine. You start drilling into the tree or nailing things into the tree's going to have to respond to that. They may or may not be able to close wounds, it may create an issue. But why it's an interesting question is, why are they good or bad for trees? What they do is facilitate people getting into trees and appreciating trees. And so maybe that tree, depending on how it's made, might not be the best for the individual tree, but psychologically, the people interacting there are now seeing and appreciating trees from good experience. And so tree population good, individual trees depends on how the tree population is.
I lost a great big tree and I want to put something else in soon. I know there's one more things I have to do that. When?
And I didn't get into that, but yeah, when to plant tree, when is the best time to plant the tree? Traditionally, spring is when people plant trees, but that's out of, in my opinion, tradition, because that's where the availability of the stock and the infrastructure is. I've had a lot of success with fall planting, you know, and it also, that typically tends to be my preferred time of year to plant, depending on the species. Spring, I think, is more of just a relic of the infrastructure, and there are costs and benefits to each of those. I mean, you can even plant into the summer as long as you're mindful of what the weather conditions are doing, and you might need to do more post-planting maintenance. Yeah, exactly, through irrigation and watering. So there's a lot of different times of year you can plant. My preferred is in the fall.
But kind of two questions. One, what causes trees to do water sprout? Because I've got a lot of a crabapple tree that tends to do that. And is it species? And then my other question is, I've got some older trees that the roots are coming up and becoming tripping now. And did I just fill in soil between the roots? Because I know you don't want to bury it too much, but how do you deal with that?
Okay, I'll address the first one, and if I forget the second one, never mind.
Okay.
Never mind. So in terms of water sprouts or epicormic shoots in trees, oftentimes some species are more predisposed to do that. And oftentimes it's in response to either stress or how the trees are managed. So like that tree is putting that growth out there so that it can photosynthesize. So something is happening. So the sprouting can occur for several reasons. One of which is through stress or physical damage to the tree. Pruning is wounding the tree and damaging the tree. So if the tree gets over pruned, depending on the species, like a crabapple, it will respond by sprouting excessively to make up for that excessive loss of foliage. And so it depends how it's maintained, I would say. And people tend to have the propensity to prune all of those off every year, and then it'll just come right. And so if you're concerned about that pruning, what I've had with success with crabapples that are excessively sprouting is be very mindful of how much you cut off, how much you prune off in a particular year. But then with those sprouts, if they become an issue, what I've had success with is I'll usually remove about a third of them. And I'll leave about roughly, like it kind of depends on the situation, but the kind of general rule for me, leave about a third of them and maybe reduce, if I can, about a third of them. And then that tends to sometimes override that pre-programming of that tree to want to sprout a whole lot more. you can kind of then use its mechanisms against itself to mitigate that.
And then the other question is about how much root coverage.
Yeah, root coverage. So I wouldn't recommend burying the roots of soil at all. The surface rooting is caused usually by that soil compaction in clay soils, and there's lack of oxygen, right? And/or irrigation. If there's a lot of irrigation, it can kind of cause some issues. There can be a relationship there. And so putting soil on those roots in any capacity, I wouldn't recommend. Mulch would be fine. But you might just have to sacrifice those parts of your yard to the tree, if it's safe to do so.
I have an American tree
Oh, yeah.
from the Emerald Ash Forest.
So American fringe tree, oh, you're gonna get me excited there. Don't be talking about that. We might never get out of here. Yeah, so the question was American fringe tree protecting from emerald ash borer. So the host range of emerald ash borer is Fraxinus, and so ash trees, and then there's been they've been able to put have successful reproduction on white fringe trees as well. And so protecting it from emerald ash borer, it can host emerald ash borer. I wouldn't say it's a preferred host, but we are in the midst of the peak infestation of emerald ash borer. And so I would say if that tree is of a high sentimental value, like how large is it?
It's probably just reaching 5.
5 foot, okay, yeah, then you would probably want to do some level of protection, but it's not gonna be a preferred post. But they can establish in what fringe trees. Yeah.
Is
Unfortunately,
that like a thing for treatment or?
the only real practical protection goal would be means of chemical protection for right now. But I would say that it's your treatment interval could be much longer on that tree. I would expect than our native ash trees that need to be protected depending on the application method, either annually or biannually, but it's in the 3 years or something, I imagine. So
Root stimulator.
I don't have a lot of experience with root stimulator. I tend to be pretty basic with my stuff. The tree requires a whole lot of maintenance in the beginning. I tend to not want to invest my time. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that.
Is there a specific, you mentioned pine or the emerald ash borer? What would it go after next? I know Colorado, the lodgepole pines first, and then the pine beetle will move to the next one when it started eliminating the herd species.
Mhm.
What's the succession for ash?
Yeah, so it's very host specific, and so Fraxinus is the host for that. And so they've done a lot of host choice studies where they've tried to get it to establish life cycles initially they thought it had a much wider host range in the elms and walnut and things like that, and they've since eliminated, like, it's not going to host switch. It won't host switch, or there's been no evidence that it's going to switch. Yeah, so if the host material disappears and it's that host specific housing, it's like gonna survive, it's regenerating, the ash trees are regenerating in the rural areas around town. And so in the north where this was first established, the prevailing initial assumption or hypothesis was that once the hosts were functionally extirpated from the beetle population could crash. That hasn't quite panned out, and then asking why, and that's because the wild ash trees are regenerating out and creating a reservoir population. They're just coming back. So now the populations are lower, but they're not crashing into non-existence. So, but they won't host switch. There's been no evidence for that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So if you're talking like a red oak tree, or you're talking an elm, like an American elm, you don't have a whole lot around, unfortunately, but if you're talking something like that, those that have known known pests that are coming in based on the wildfowl signature of those trees. So when a tree is wounded, they'll basically smell the effect insects. And so nailing into that, anytime you're wounding that tree will have a response. And something like an elm tree, it will, at the wrong time of year, it can attract the beetles in, and if the beetles have that fungus and vector vegetable disease into that tree. And there's other examples of that, but that's just the one that came to mind. And so certainly be mindful of that. You can potentially cause or instigate a disease issue in the trees if done at the wrong, wounding it at the wrong time of year. Depends. Oh, no, it's great.
I'll give the questions right over here just for a little bit.